What is up, everyone? It's Quinn here, and in today's video, I'm going to be talking about 5 players who are skyrocketing up my fantasy football rankings. So this could be because of new information we've learned within the last few weeks. This could also just be, I've looked a little bit deeper into these guys, and I think there are some things to like for them for fantasy this year. But let's dive right into the first player. I'm going to start off here with Rhamondre Stevenson, and he is someone where we've gotten some new information within the last few weeks. After the 2023 season, his outlook for fantasy was a little bit questionable, both for 2024 and then from a dynasty perspective, just the rest of his career. He was the running back 27 in fantasy points per game, which was underwhelming for him. You also had a revamped coaching staff, so you don't really know where the loyalties lie. And then the Patriots signed Antonio Gibson in free agency. So even though Rhamondre had performed well throughout his career, there was really no guarantee that he would be stepping right back in as the clear-cut RB1. Antonio Gibson is also a guy who had kind of shown some flashes throughout his career. A lot of people thought he was being misutilized in Washington. Maybe the Patriots saw him, they liked him, and they wanted to establish some sort of 1-2 punch here with him and Rhamondre Stevenson. But the news of the recent extension that Rhamondre Stevenson just signed, in my opinion, is huge for his fantasy outlook. He signed a 4-year, $36 million contract with $17 million guaranteed. That's not a contract you just throw out to someone who you want to, put in a 50-50 split, a 55-45 committee. That's someone who you want to be your running back one moving forward. To put that into perspective, Rhamondre got 4 for 36. Antonio Gibson got 3 for 11. Rhamondre is a guy who has already flashed his fantasy upside. He was the running back 10 in points per game in 2022, and he did that while only scoring 6 touchdowns in 17 games. So back-end RB1, it's a solid ceiling to look at, but it could have been even higher if he had some more touchdown upside. Now, I don't know if it's going to happen for him this year with this Patriots offense. It's not going to be a top-tier unit, but I just don't think there's any way they're as bad as they were last year. They were dead last at 13.9 points per game. The offense wasn't even getting 14 points a game. It's going to be tough to be productive there. They drafted Drake May. 6 of their 7 draft picks were on offense. 2 were O-linemen. 2 were wide receivers. So they're at least trying to build up this offense here. Rhamondre is a big running back. He can catch passes. I think he has the workhorse ability and the workhorse size. So I think with this recent extension, I'm just much more comfortable drafting him in that mid-tier RB2 area compared to how I would have felt before that extension. Now, the next player I'm going to be higher on moving forward is going to be Zamir White, another running back. And to be totally honest, it's not the typical running back profile that I'd normally be looking at in fantasy drafts. Zamir White has a lot of the characteristics that you'd see in your typical dead zone running back, the guys that you'd normally want to avoid. He's getting propped up in drafts because of projected volume. He's an unproven running back, so he's getting that volume pushed on him. But do we really know what we're going to have here? And then also it's a questionable offensive situation. But I also think there are some key things that make Zamir White very interesting. The first one is that a lot of the time when we get these running backs where people are projecting this huge workload, they're unproven guys, normally we haven't seen them in that role, right? Maybe the starter left, or they sign in free agency. Something happened where we haven't actually seen them within that offense. We have a set of games where Zamir White operated as the running back 1, where Josh Jacobs was out last year, and the Raiders force-fed him. Week 15, 17 carries, 4 targets. Week 16, 22 carries, 1 target. Week 17, 20 carries, 6 targets. Week 18, 25 carries, 2 targets. So the fewest amount of opportunities he had in a single game was 21. So in the 4 games last year with no Josh Jacobs, Zamir White was absolutely getting fed the ball. And it wasn't just empty volume. They're here, take this. And he was sucking it up, being inefficient. He was efficient with those opportunities. He was at 0.33 rushing yards over expected per attempt. Compare that to Josh Jacobs, who was at negative 0.37. Zamir White was the better pure runner last year. And then we just look at the running back competition. It is very, very thin. Alexander Madison's probably going to be the running back 2. He was rough last year, negative 0.25 rushing yards over expected per attempt. He's been sub 4 yards per carry for 3 straight seasons. The current running back 3 and 4 are Amir Abdullah and Dylan Laube. So the competition's not there. It really seems like the Raiders really love Zamir White. I'm confident that they want to go out there and really feed a running back, and I think Zamir White's going to be that guy. And based on what we saw in a somewhat limited sample last year, I think he can, perform pretty well with that volume. So definitely getting higher here on Zamir White. Now, pivoting over to the wide receiver position, I want to talk about T. Higgins. And he's a guy where, we haven't had some huge shift. We don't, know what's going on the trade front. But at this point, I'm just assuming he's staying with the Bengals here for this season. But when you really just dig into his last 2 seasons, they seem kind of, like he's underwhelming, underperforming. Higgins has been the victim of some pretty unfortunate situations over those past 2 years. Last year, he was the wide receiver 40 in points per game, a big letdown. That season's pretty easy to chalk up to the Joe Burrow injuries. He was injured early on, not 100%, and then was out towards the end of the year. So not surprising that the wide receiver 2, in an offense kind of struggles when the starter goes down, and not just any starter, like a top-tier NFL quarterback. But then also we look at 2022, he was the wide receiver 20 in points per game, which solid season, but I'm pretty sure he was being drafted as probably at worst a high-end wide receiver 2, so still a little bit disappointing. But in his healthy games, he was just so much better than that wide receiver 20 rank would kind of lead you to believe. And it wasn't like he got hit in the injury department where he was missing big chunks of the season, something like that where his total game number is down. He was getting injured, but he was not missing games. So he left week 1 early on with injury. Then he got hurt in week 4. So he's on the injury report. We don't know if he's going to play going into week 5. And then the same thing going into week 14. He ends up being active for both of those games. And then he ran a combined 7 total routes. So if you had him for fantasy, you probably remember this very clearly because it was a situation where it's am I going to start T. Higgins? He's on the injury report. And then they say he's going to play, you probably started him, and then the Bengals just don't have him out there. So it was just a very weird situation where they weren't ruling him out, but they also weren't playing him. So he was, suiting up. Those games count for his fantasy points per game, but he wasn't giving you anything. If you remove those injured games, he would have been the wide receiver 12 at 16.6 points per game. And then when we look back to 2021, he was healthy, Burrow was healthy, he was the wide receiver 12 in points per game. So when you have a healthy T. Higgins and a healthy Joe Burrow, T. Higgins is a fringe wide receiver 1. We haven't had that over the past 2 seasons, but right now you can draft him as a wide receiver 3. And I don't think this is a situation where T. Higgins is injury prone, Joe Burrow is super injury prone. I think they've kind of just gotten unlucky. This could have, happened to pretty much any duo here. So I think T. Higgins is due for a bounce back. And I think as long as he can stay healthy, Burrow can stay healthy, I really feel like he's a steal as a wide receiver 3 at this point. Another wide receiver I'm getting higher on here is going to be Diontae Johnson. And I've been pretty in on Diontae over the past 2 seasons. I know especially 2 years ago I was in on him. Did not work out. He's been the wide receiver 39 in points per game in both of those seasons. But we also just have to acknowledge the offensive situations he's been put in has been pretty rough. And I think you can make the argument, right? He underperformed those 2 seasons. He, probably might not be in the best situation again here in 2024. Last year, the Panthers' offense was awful. They had the fewest passing yards, the second fewest passing touchdowns, actually tied with the Steelers, Diontae Johnson's former team. But even on that bad offense, they still had a wide receiver be pretty fantasy relevant. Adam Thielen, 33-year-old Adam Thielen, was the wide receiver 25 in points per game. Now, Thielen did play primarily out of the slot, which I don't think Diontae's going to do. But I don't think it was the slot role was why Thielen was so productive. I mean, maybe it was part of it, but it was pretty much the offensive line was terrible. Bryce Young had to get the ball out quickly. And then also the wide receiver play was just horrific across the board. So you really couldn't count on anyone to really get open down the field, which is why we've seen them invest in the offensive line and invest in the wide receiver room this offseason. It looks like the Panthers want Diontae Johnson to play X, and I think they've at least made a solid effort to improve this offense around Bryce Young. They brought in Dave Canales to be the head coach. He did a great job with the Bucs in his first year as the offensive coordinator. They added Diontae Johnson. They added Xavier Legette in the draft. And Diontae Johnson's a guy who has already showcased a high fantasy ceiling. This guy averaged 17.2 PPR points per game in 2021. That was the wide receiver 8 in points per game. So I think he's going to step in here on this Panthers offense. I think he's going to be the wide receiver 1 from day one. Maybe you like Xavier Legette. I'm not super sold. He's going to be balling out in year 1. Mingo seems like it's probably not going to work out. Adam Thielen is pretty old at this point. So I think Diontae is going to be their top weapon. I think this is going to be a much improved offense, and I think he's going to command a lot of volume. We've already seen him have a big season. He's going outside the top 36 wide receivers. He's going that wide receiver 40 range. At that price, I'm definitely willing to hit the draft button on Diontae. And then the final player here who I'm moving up my rankings is going to be Mark Andrews. And positionally, I'm not like skyrocketing Mark Andrews to be the tight end 1. He's actually my tight end 4 at this point. But I just think the gap between him and Laporta and Kelsey is significantly closer right now than what the ADP is suggesting. Last year, Mark Andrews was the tight end 5 in points per game, but when you remove his Week 11 game where he played 4 snaps, then left with injury and was out for the rest of the regular season, if you remove that game, he would have averaged 14.6 PPR points per game, which literally would have been tied with Travis Kelce and TJ Hockenson for the tight end 1. Mark Andrews will be 29 when the season starts. He's not at any risk of like falling off a cliff, having a fall off due to his age. And I think he arguably has less target competition than he did last year. The wide receiver room outside of Zay Flowers and I guess Rashad Bateman, there's not a ton going on. OBJ is gone. He is going to be, worst case, the number 2 target on this offense. And he's also flashed an elite tight end ceiling. 2021, averaged 17.7 PPR points per game. That is something that only Travis Kelce, amongst the active tight ends, can flex that they've done that. None of these other tight ends have proven that kind of ceiling at this point. You have the younger options, McBride, Kincaid, Laporta. Could they get there? Maybe. But Mark Andrews has done it and is still in the prime of his career. So I don't even think there should be like a full round of ADP difference between Andrews and Kelsey and those guys. So even though I have him as my tight end 4, I just think that group of like the top 4 tight ends should be clumped pretty close together. And on some platforms, it's even larger than like one round of ADP. So I like Mark Andrews here. I think he should be very, very close to those other tight ends. You could probably even make an argument he should be ahead of them, but he certainly shouldn't be going like a round plus later than those guys. So those are the 5 players who are skyrocketing up my rankings: Rhamondre Stevenson, Zamir White, T. Higgins, Diontae Johnson, and Mark Andrews. Let me know your guys' thoughts on these players down below. Are you interested in them at their current ADP? But thank you all for stopping by, and I will see you in the next one.